All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We'll go ahead and get started now. This is the first event kicking off our Afrofuturism themed week of the National Science Policy Network's Black History Month celebration. So we're really excited to have you join us today and really excited to welcome our speaker, Dr. Priscilla Layne. Before we get started, I just really quickly want to shout out the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of NSPN, who has put together this entire month's worth of programming. And we'll talk a little bit more about what is coming up ahead at the end of today's session. But this organization and this team has been really excited about highlighting a lot of what is going on in science, in Black history, and in Afrofuturism. So we're excited to have you here to learn with us today. My name is Sindhu Nathan. I am a chemical engineering PhD candidate at Stanford, and I will be your moderator. So for the most part, I will be shutting up and just facilitating the Q&A at the end of today's presentation. But if you have any questions or like technical difficulties, feel free to shoot a message in the chat and I'll see if I can address it. Otherwise, feel very comfortable using the Q&A either to ask your own questions or upvote someone else's that you're really interested in hearing the answer to, and I will make sure to get those questions asked so that we can all learn together. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Priscilla Layne. Dr. Layne is an associate professor of German and adjunct associate professor of African American and Diaspora Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She received her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, and her research and teaching focuses on postcolonial studies, gender studies, and critical race theory to address topics like the representation of Blackness in literature and film, rebellion, and the concept of other in science fiction and fantasy. She is an author herself, and she has written a book called White Rebels in Black, German Appropriation of African American Culture, and she's currently working on a project on Afro-German Afrofuturism. So one of the reasons I'm really excited to hear from her is because a lot of what we think about, even if we think about Afrofuturism, is very US centric. So I'm really excited to get a more global perspective and see how these themes are really prevalent everywhere and not limited to just, the United States. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen, turn my camera off, and hand the floor off to her.
Thank you, Sindhu, for that introduction. I'll just get started in a second. I'm sharing my PowerPoint. Here we go. Okay, so this will just give you all an idea of the topics that I hope to address today in my talk, and I really look forward to all of your questions later. Hold on. So I'll just get started. This billboard is an art installation created by artist Alicia Wormsley, which was displayed as part of an art project called The Last Billboard in Pittsburgh. That is until the building's owner demanded it be taken down. Evelyn Picker of We Do Property Management told ArtNet News that she, quote, received complaints from a number of people in the local community who said that they found the message offensive and divisive, end quote. This begs one to ask, what is so offensive about asserting the presence of Black people in the future? One can interpret this billboard as responding to several different discourses around race and futurity. If one were to think in terms of science fiction, it is true that for many decades, the future that was imagined by white authors and directors did not contain Black people, a phenomenon Adolfo Nama addresses in his book, Black Space. Take, for example, Michael Anderson's sci-fi classic, Logan's Run, directed in 1976. The film imagines a dystopian future in which the environment on Earth has become uninhabitable due to pollution. As an answer to this problem, a population of Americans find refuge within a protected biodome. But due to a limited amount of space, once inhabitants reach the age of 30, they must be killed, a brutal attempt to maintain the balance of the population. When one looks at these screenshots from the film, what one notices is not just that the future Logan's Run imagines is populated solely with attractive young people, they are also only white. which might lead one to ask, where have all the Black people gone in the future? This common practice of imagining a future without Black people was even parodied in the science fiction story Space Traders, written by African-American law professor Derek Bell, and later made into a film in 1994. In Space Traders, a typical sci-fi trope is invoked. An alien race mysteriously lands on Earth, causing hysteria and fear. But rather than threatening Earth with violence, the aliens offer humans a deal. They promise to resolve all of Earth's environmental problems and shower the planet with riches if they agree to give the aliens all of the Black people by a certain date. But the aliens make no mention of what they plan to do with the Black people. As the action of the film takes place in the US, the ethical question at the core of the film appears to be, would white Americans be willing to sacrifice African Americans for a magical cure to society's problems? But the real question one should ask is, why would white Americans think that removing African Americans from society might solve their problems? Thus, though this question is posed in the form of sci-fi, Bell is actually engaging with a centuries-old debate that has plagued American society since the days of slavery, namely the debate among white Americans as to whether Black people have an intrinsic value. This audacious question is naturally rooted in the racist thinking that has plagued the US since its founding. Are Black people humans of equal value to whites? If they are, why are they being enslaved? Those of you familiar with the 3/5 compromise passed as part of the 14th Amendment will know that the answer our founding fathers came up with was that no, Blacks are not humans of equal value to whites. Rather, one enslaved Black person is the equivalent of 3/5 of a white person. This dehumanization of Black people, which was literally written into the US Constitution until it was repealed in 1868, justified the enslavement, abuse, exploitation, and killing of Black people in the US. And even after slavery was abolished in 1865, these racist anti-Black beliefs didn't simply disappear. Rather, now that Blacks were no longer under the thumb of the institution of slavery, white Americans fantasized about ridding the US of Blacks, with the justification that they were inherently more ignorant and lazy than whites, and that Black men in particular posed a threat to white society and white supremacy because they allegedly posed the threat of sexual violence against white women. Plenty of African Americans have since attempted to argue that Black Americans do in fact have intrinsic value for American society. One example thereof is Anna Julia Cooper's essay, What Are We Worth?, published in 1892. In it, Cooper writes, I once heard Henry Ward Beecher make this remark, were Africa and the Africans to sink tomorrow, how much poorer would the world be? A little less gold and ivory, a little less coffee, a considerable ripple perhaps. Where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans would come together, that is all. Not a poem, not an invention, not a piece of art would be missed from the world. And this degrading statement actually came from an abolitionist, Henry Ward Beecher, a clergyman and social reformer who believed slavery should be abolished, and whose sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, famously published the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. Clearly, his opposition to slavery did not mean he saw any intrinsic value in Black life. And the fact that 129 years later, a slogan like Black Lives Matter is even necessary suggests that African Americans still don't feel our society recognizes the intrinsic value of our lives, nor has it ceased in dehumanizing us. And this is one of the reasons why taking a colorblind approach to working with Black, Indigenous, and students of color doesn't work. And anti-racist pedagogy is not about ignoring difference, it's about acknowledging difference and striving towards equity and inclusion. And as you can see from Ibrahim X. Kendi's book, Anti-Racist Baby, it is never too early to address these issues. And I find the way that he states it for children is very simple. Anti-racist baby learns all the colors, not because race is true. If you claim to be colorblind, you deny what's right in front of you. No one will see racism if we only stay silent. If we don't name racism, it won't stop being so violent. So to tell a Black person that you don't see color and therefore it doesn't matter to you is not just a statement of extreme privilege, but it denies them their reality, because Black people know that mainstream society sees them as different and treats them differently. They're aware of this from a very early age. I recall an excerpt from Ta-Nehisi Coates' best-selling book, Between the World and Me, where he tried to describe what it's like as a young Black American to realize how different your reality is, not just because of cultural differences, but because of the ways in which institutional and structural racism determine your life. And interestingly, Coates employs scientific metaphors like the laws of physics and the existence of different galaxies to make his point. Remarking on the moment in his life when he realized the great disparity between his reality in West Baltimore and that of white America, Coates writes, "Comparing these dispatches with the facts of my native world, I came to understand that my country was a galaxy, and this galaxy stretched from the pandemonium of West Baltimore to the happy hunting grounds of Mr. Belvedere. I obsessed over the distance between the other sector of space and my own. I knew that my portion of the American galaxy, where bodies were enslaved by a tenacious gravity, was Black, and that the other liberated portion was not. I knew that some inscrutable energy preserved the breach. I felt, but did not yet understand, the relation between the other world and me. And I felt in this a cosmic injustice, a profound cruelty, which infused an abiding irrepressible desire to unshackle my body and achieve the velocity of escape." What Coates describes here is how incomprehensible America can seem to a Black person who has not yet understood the role of racism in American society. For a young Black child who sees herself as a human being and believes that all human beings are treated equally according to the law, the implications of racism and the incredible disparity Black Americans face seems like an inexplicable energy or force. Thus, instead of adopting a colorblind attitude, Kyoko Kishimoto encourages educators to adopt an anti-racist pedagogy, which means, quote, teaching about race and racism in a way that fosters critical analytical skills which reveal the power relations behind racism and how race has been institutionalized in the US society to create and justify inequalities, end quote. And I highly recommend this article for everyone to read, especially if you teach in higher education. I wanted to mention two more quotes that I found really useful from her essay. So she suggests that a useful way of discussing race and racism in the classroom is to talk about the context of your discipline. How was your discipline formed? What kinds of attitudes informed it? And for those who are white faculty to realize that you are also racialized and gendered and come to the classroom with certain views that will affect how you interact with the students and the material. So just some ideas, of how one might address the issue of race and racism in the classroom, in science classrooms. You can wonder how Black, Indigenous, and people of color have not been given access to your fields. Are there BIPOC who have contributed to your field who have not been given recognition? Are there ways in which racist ideology has contributed to the methods of the field? There I thought of the ways in which racism has impacted the development of artificial intelligence. And finally, has your field been misused for a racist project? Like the ways in which biology and medicine in this country have been misused for the purpose of white supremacy. So, in the text Metamorphosis, Jamaican philosopher Sylvia Wynter proposes that in order to break free of their dehumanization under slavery and colonialism, Black people in the Western Hemisphere employed a process of indigenization, which she describes as both, quote, physical revolt and cultural reinvention. Blacks reinvented themselves as natives of the New World through a process of cultural creation. Intrinsic to this culture is a refusal to accept those assumptions of Western civilizations which dehumanize, inferiorize them by exploiting their devalued labor power, end quote. Afrofuturism could be considered one of these cultural creations that Blacks in the Western Hemisphere have invented during this process of indigenization. Truthfully, like many musical genres with their origins in the Black diaspora, Afrofuturism is an art form that is understood by many to have originated in the US and since spread worldwide. Especially in recent years with the success of popular media like Disney's Black Panther movie and the Marvel reboot of the comic, Netflix's Luke Cage series, and HBO's Lovecraft Country, and newer comics like Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur. Interest in Afrofuturism has exploded. So what is Afrofuturism exactly? The term Afrofuturism was first coined in 1994 by white American cultural theorist Mark Derry, who conceived of it as speculative fiction that treats African American themes and addresses African American concerns in the context of 20th century technoculture and more generally African American signification that appropriates images of technology and a prosthetically enhanced future. Because Derry's definition was focused solely on African American culture, he neglected to identify the ways in which Afrofuturism resonated across the Black diaspora. Furthermore, since Derry, Black scholars, especially those critical of early Afrofuturist texts concerned with gaining recognition from whites, question how liberating a term can be if it is defined by a white scholar. Since the publication of Derry's essay, there has been a wealth of academic texts exploring the term, written and edited primarily by Black scholars from around the world, and particularly from the US and the UK. While a multitude of definitions exist for the term, I prefer Sandra Jackson and Julie E. Moody Freeman's definition in their edited volume, The Black Imagination, Science Fiction, Futurism, and the Speculative. They see Afrofuturism as encompassing a variety of subgenres, including historical fiction, fantasy and myth, and magical realism, as long as the content, quote, draws upon non-Western cosmologies to interrogate and critique current conditions of Black and other people of color, end quote. Prior to the emergence of Afrofuturism as a descriptor, there were certainly other examples of writing in the African diaspora that departed from reality. For example, Esther L. Jones notes that Black speculative fiction existed as early as 1859. A few other examples from around the African diaspora are the Caribbean Surrealist Group, founded in 1932, and the magical realism of Nigerian author Ben Okri. But because of its characteristic as a supergenre, speculative fiction can encompass anything that, quote, deliberately departs from imitating our consensus reality of everyday experience, end quote. But I prefer to use the term Afrofuturism as an umbrella term, precisely for the ways in which it challenges our assumptions about genre and our desire to neatly categorize things. The term reflects my belief that Afrofuturist texts are not just about visions of the future, science, technology, or space travel, but rather Afrofuturism embraces both the past and the future, imagining alternative worlds and realities as a way of seeking liberation for Black people, whether psychologically or physically. Daylan K. English also reminds us that Afrofuturism comprises cultural production and scholarly thought as vastly different as art, photography, film, multimedia art, performance art, music, and theory. In my first book, White Rebels in Black, I address what differentiates Afrofuturism from Italian Futurism, which announced its existence to the world with the publication of Tommaso Marinetti's The Founding and Manifesto of Futurism in 1909. I described Afrofuturism as decidedly different from Italian Futurism, which in comparison is hostile to the past, misogynistic, pro-war, fascist, and a cult of youth. But Italian artists were not the only ones who embarked on this future-oriented path in the early 20th century. Futurism would eventually reach as far north as Sweden and as far south as Spain and Portugal. The only other country in which Futurism developed alongside Italy was in Russia, where Futurism is generally divided into two categories, Cubo Futurism and Ego Futurism. Since the disappearance of these avant-garde futurisms, additional more modern futurisms have emerged, and I've listed some here: Sinto Futurism, Gulf Futurism, they've emerged in subaltern spaces where artists and scholars attempt to claim the future for themselves. Part of what makes Afrofuturism unique to these other futurisms for other racial ethnic groups or other cultures is that Afrofuturism is not solely concerned with the future and hostile to the past. In fact, Afrofuturists are highly appreciative of the past, and their interest in technology does not necessitate a rejection of pre-modern epistemologies. Afrofuturism embodies the Asante Adinkra Sankofa symbol of looking to the future and looking back. It allows African diasporic artists who feel alienated from their native cultures, either as a result of transatlantic slavery or colonialism, to reimagine their past and counter previous Eurocentric attitudes that cast Africa's past as primitive, backward, and outside of history. Instead, Afrofuturism allows Black people to simultaneously envision themselves as technologically savvy enough to conquer future problems, while also reclaiming real or imagined histories that they have been previously denied. I also believe it is essential that Afrofuturist work seeks to liberate Black people without being hierarchical. Finally, Afrofuturism acknowledges the unique non-human status to which Black people have been assigned since transatlantic slavery. Now, to get to the origins of Afrofuturism so that we can explore some of the themes that have been addressed, pinpointing the origins of Afrofuturism depends largely on what medium is your focus. If we speak in terms of literature, a few examples of speculative fiction are often mentioned in the genealogy. Pauline Hopkins' publication of One Blood from 1902 and George Schuyler's novel Black No More from 1930 are two examples. Each novel reflects a different trope of Afrofuturist thought. Hopkins' novel could be understood as a precursor to the Black Panther story. Her protagonist, Royal Briggs, is a Black American man passing for white in the WASP circles of Ivy League universities on the East Coast. Briggs goes on an expedition to Africa where he not only discovers a hidden civilization in Ethiopia called Meroe that has advanced technologies since 6000 BC, but he also discovers he is the rightful inheritor of the dynasty based on his ancestry, and he is asked to remain there and accept his role as king. Hopkins' novel represents the thread of Afrofuturism that seeks to recover lost, remarkable African civilizations that have otherwise been denied by history in order to justify the enslavement of Black people on the grounds of their inferiority. Schuyler's novel explores the more technological side of Afrofuturism by presenting us with a dystopian world where a Black American scientist goes to Germany and invents a potion that can turn Black people white. While Hopkins' novel sought to grant Black people dignity through a claim to regal ancestry, much like Black Americans' Afrocentrism of the 1970s, Schuyler's novel is more cynical and argues that even if there were no racial differences possible based on grounds of appearance, white people would still find alternative ways of policing an imagined boundary between alleged superior and inferior groups. Schuyler's text is considered Afrofuturist because he depicts African Americans utilizing advanced technology in an attempt to solve the race problem by making themselves white. While this works for a brief period, allowing Blacks who have undergone the treatment to get better jobs, marry into white families, and move to better neighborhoods, racism isn't eradicated in the book, ultimately because white people insist on defining new parameters for whiteness. Thus, American society becomes divided into the old and the new whites, the new ones being those whose complexion is actually deemed too pale. In performance art and music, the origin of Afrofuturism is often assigned to avant-garde jazz artist Sun Ra, who was born with the name Sonny Blount in Birmingham, Alabama in 1914, and is considered to be a musical child prodigy, composing original songs for the piano while still in grade school. In the 1950s, he claimed that he had been abducted by aliens. As a young man, he moved to Chicago, changed his name to Sun Ra, inspired by the Egyptian sun god, and claimed that he was actually from the planet Saturn. Additionally, throughout his life, Ra was interested in both technology, so he was one of the first Black artists to play the Moog synthesizer, space travel, and ancient Egyptian culture and epistemologies. In his 1972 film Space is the Place, Ra lands in Oakland in a spaceship vowing to rescue African Americans and Latinx Americans from racism. In addition to Hopkins, Schuyler, and Sun Ra, some additional examples that might readily come to mind are the music of the funk band Parliament, which explored space themes in the lyrics and artwork for their album Mothership Connection, and in the science fiction of Octavia Butler and Samuel Delany, who are both award-winning authors of the more diverse new wave of science fiction. Despite coining the term in Afrofuturism in 1994, as you can see from the much earlier dates of these works, Derry was attempting to retroactively describe a cultural and theoretical phenomenon that reached back decades. Indeed, Afrofuturism has really taken off in the mainstream as a major movie and television studios invest in speculative fiction told from the margins. A few recent examples include HBO's recent series Lovecraft Country, directed by Jordan Peele, which retells African-American history by intertwining the terror of white supremacy with supernatural monsters. It is no coincidence that the book from which the series was adapted is named after H.P. Lovecraft, who was not only an important figure in the history of science fiction, but whose work has also been criticized for its racism. By including Black characters who must negotiate their love for 1950s sci-fi with their knowledge of its racism, the series addresses a key problem many Black sci-fi fans have had to confront. HBO also has the forthcoming series Who Fears Death, based on the 2010 novel by Nnedi Okorafor, which explores the coming-of-age story of a young girl in post-apocalyptic North Africa. And further examples are, of course, Marvel's Black Panther and Disney's film adaptation of A Wrinkle in Time. Originally published as a book by Madeleine L'Engle in 1962, this is another coming-of-age story about a young girl who, with the help of 3 supernatural female characters, travels through space and time to save her scientist father, who disappeared after experimenting with tesseracts. While the original protagonist in the book is white, in her film adaptation, African-American director Ava DuVernay intentionally rewrote the main character as Black, thus making the film Afrofuturist because it depicts a confident Black girl who uses science and fantasy to time travel. So far, all of my examples showing Afrofuturism in text and performance have focused on African Americans, with the exception of Nnedi Okorafor's book. To briefly address the question of why Afrofuturism matters more generally and why it might matter outside of the US, for example, why it matters to Black Germans, who happen to be the subject of my research, I refer to a blog post by that name, Why Afrofuturism Matters by Elizabeth Reich. Reich writes that because representations of the future have often been populated solely by white people, just by engaging with Afrofuturist art, we are, quote unquote, watching the future change in the present. Speaking specifically about the state of Blackness in the US, Reich writes, in a world in which African Americans constitute nearly 1 million of the 2.3 million prison population, 40% of African American males between the ages of 15 and 34 who died were murdered, and more than 26% of African Americans live below the poverty line, Afrofuturist art and politics become a conduit to another galaxy in which Blackness survives, and a way of articulating the urgency of real Black freedom. While Germany may not have this exact form of school-to-prison pipeline of institutional racism as in the US, the question of whether or not Black lives have mattered in the past and whether they will matter in the future is a shared concern with Black people in Germany. Although the first Black German community was established as early as the 1910s, the history of Black Germans tends to be overlooked and ignored, if not systematically erased. White Germans have long preferred to think of Germany as a homogeneous white nation. In Germany today, anti-Blackness enters the public discourse in the form of neo-Nazi violence, police brutality, mistreatment of Black refugees, and the disregard for Black life lost in the Mediterranean. Afrofuturist texts have proven themselves to have an international appeal, including in Black communities in Germany. In Berlin, for example, the Black German Community Center, Each One Teach One, organized an all-Black screening of Black Panther in a theater in the multicultural district of Wedding. Black Panther has especially energized Black German youth, as they can often be heard chanting Wakanda Forever at Black Lives Matter protests. One of the reasons the film Black Panther had such a strong influence in the present-day Black German community is that as an Afrofuturist text, rather than merely reacting to racism or attempting to educate white people about race, the film also inspired Black people with a vision of what the future could look like in a world of Black agency and empowerment, when knowledge and technology are used to better the conditions of Black people rather than to oppress them. In line with the trend of Afrofuturism, Black German artists have grown less concerned with responding to racism and more interested in building community and working towards a future in which they can thrive. So to give you an example of what a Black German Afrofuturist text might look like, I offer you a reading of a performance called First Black Woman in Space by Black German artist Simone Dede Aivi from 2016. There are 3 critiques of Afrofuturism, which I think Aivi's performance does a good job of addressing. Authors like Y. Tasha Womack, who literally wrote the book on Afrofuturism, and Martine Sims, author of the Mundane Afrofuturist Manifesto, have warned that simply imagining Black astronauts or Black people in space is not enough to make changes in our world or create an alternative world to ours that is free of white supremacy and sexism. Sims writes, for example, the dream of utopia can encourage us to forget that outer space will not save us from injustice and that cyberspace was prefigured upon a master-slave relationship. The imaginative challenge that awaits any mundane Afrofuturist author who accepts that this is it, Earth is all we have, what will we do with it? Likewise, another critique that has been aimed at Afrofuturism is that its fantasies about space and time travel, alien life, and alternative histories, like Black Panther, do not offer concrete tools to help Black people, people's present life on Earth. In fact, this is one reason why some African artists have described themselves as African futurists rather than Afrofuturists. And this is a point I will return to at the end of my presentation with a brief reading of the short film Poomsie. I believe Aivi's performance, First Black Woman in Space, demonstrates just what it would be like to turn Afrofuturist thought into activism and other forms of concrete action. I believe Aivi achieves this by combining her performance with testimonies from Black German women. In Aivi's performance, while the space of performance art allows her to make predictions about the future and both imagine and enact other realities, the testimonies of Black German women, which are present in the form of pre-recorded interviews, are what creates a dialectic of fantasy and reality. Rather than taking you through the performance chronologically, I have divided up my remarks to what I've identified as 2 core concepts: representation and the future. So on representation, at a conference I attended a few years back, hosted by UNC's Department of African American and Diaspora Studies, a member of the audience questioned why some of the presenters were bothering to discuss racist representations of Black people in films. The person asked, does focusing on this kind of quote unquote representational racism detract from quote unquote real issues like gun violence? In The Witch's Flight, African American film scholar Kara Keeling remarks that art, like film and television, quote, conflates the 2 valences of representation, the aesthetic and the political. This is not because film or television reflects reality or imposes itself on real life. It is because the labor required to make sense of the images that cinematic machines select, cut, frame, and circulate is the same kind of labor required to live in and make sense of the world organized by the cinematic. So Thus, having the wrong kind of representation can be dangerous because it reinforces a form of common sense understanding that can be detrimental for Black people in real life. Rather than focusing on negative representations, Ayivi's performance primarily considers the potential effects of positive representation. When Ayivi's performance begins, the stage is shrouded in darkness. What is faintly visible are two chairs facing the audience. One is empty and one has an empty astronaut suit slumped inside of it, and that'll be important later on. Off stage, Ayivi begins her monologue. Initially, we cannot see her, but she is soon faintly illuminated. Her monologue begins. Dr. May C. Jemison had been interested in natural sciences and mathematics since she was a child, but sometimes she also watched television. Lieutenant Uhura was the first woman that she saw weekly on television working in a technical occupation. Seeing Lieutenant Uhura evoked a new picture of possibilities for May Jemison. In any case, she claims that if it had not been for Uhura, she would never have gotten the idea of becoming an astronaut. And so in 1992, she became the first woman of color from the planet Earth who traveled into space. As you can see from the quote, these statements are organized according to consecutive slides. The idea is that with each statement, Ayivi is changing the slides of a projector. This invokes the feeling of a relative presenting photos from their family album, but instead of photos of Jemison or Uhura, Ayivi switches between slides of stars. So the metaphor of the family album is important because one of the striking things about how the performance begins is that Ayivi refers to Jemison not as the first African American or even the first Black woman in space, despite the performance's title, but as the first woman of color in space. Both the performance's title, First Black Woman in Space, and Ayivi's language here, First Woman of Color in Space, indicate that Ayivi does not identify Jemison as American, but as Black, as a person of color, and most importantly, as a woman. Thus, Jemison is not associated with the US, but with Earth. This is a universalizing gesture. Jemison becomes an aspiring figure, not just for African Americans, but for people of color on the planet Earth, which is a particularly post-nationalist perspective. This seemingly minor detail is important because these first lines spoken by Ayivi introduce us to the topic of representation and the importance of representation for aspirations. In this moment of the performance, representation is relevant in multiple layers. Jemison is an important figure for Ayivi because her journey into space conveyed to Ayivi that a Black woman could do anything. And in Jemison's case, her aspirations are directly linked to Nichols' role as Uhura on Star Trek. What is notable about how Ayivi tells the story is that her narrative blurs the lines between representation and reality. Following Ayivi's narrative, it is impossible to tell which person, the real astronaut Jemison or the imagined space traveler Nichols, had more of an impact on Black people. This is conveyed when Ayivi also relays how years after her first mission, Jemison finally got to meet Nichols at a Star Trek convention. And understandably, Nichols was just as excited about meeting Jemison as Jemison was about meeting Nichols. At a moment of improvisation, Ayivi departs from the script and asks, quote, "So who actually was the first Black woman in space?" End quote. Jemison will go down in the history books as the first Black female astronaut, but if she hadn't seen Nichols perform that role on television, would she have ever become an astronaut? Ayivi ends this portion of the performance with the profound statement, "You cannot be what you cannot see." Following the introduction to Jemison, Ayivi is then illuminated on stage, wearing Black overalls, Black boots, and a Black t-shirt. She then goes over to the two white patio chairs and sits down across from the empty spacesuit. With a pile of index cards in her hand, Ayivi then pretends to interview Jemison, who is represented by the empty astronaut suit. Ayivi poses a series of questions to Jemison, pausing for just a few seconds following each one. The silence stands in for a response. Ayivi's series of questions occur in installments, which are broken up over the performance and intertwined with other performative aspects. Some of the questions she poses are, what is a role model? Or what does digital diaspora mean? The silence with which Ivey's questions are met could also be interpreted as positive, as allowing space for multiple answers and therefore multiple possibilities. So the second concept I want to discuss in Ivey's performance is the future. Namely, how does Afrofuturist thought help us work towards a better future? In his critique of Afro-pessimism, African-American philosophy professor Lewis Gordon first identifies a core problem with pessimists in general, stating they make, quote, the presumption that what is at stake is what can be known. To determine what can be done is the problem. Gordon answers this by stating, quote, the future is yet to come. The question isn't what will be or how do we know what will be, but instead the realization that whatever is done will be that on which the future will depend, end quote. So Ivey enacts this way of thinking about the future during one segment of the performance, which occurs midway through the entire thing. She lies down on the floor on top of a giant white inflatable cloud and speaks the following monologue. We look up at the stars. We want to go up. We can break through glass ceilings together. We get wounds. We have splinters in our hair. We slump on the couch. We pick the splinters out of each other's hair. Cuts in brown skin, glass splinters in our hair, up and down, up, woman after woman after woman, and now all together, we don't know exactly how many hit their heads until there was the first crack in the glass. How heavy was their impact? How deep are the cuts? We do not know how many more attacks will be necessary. In this monologue, Ivey is basically asking women, and likely Black women in particular, to imagine that they can and they will break through whatever glass ceilings have been put in their way. And she stresses they will likely experience some cuts and setbacks along the way, but it's important to keep going. It is particularly striking that Ivey says we will never know how many bang their heads to create tiny cracks before one finally breaks through. In this monologue, she acknowledges that each new generation stands on the shoulders of those who struggled before them, but also that even the current generation has to accept the fact that they may not live to see the future they are fighting for. So, a further way that the future is invoked is how Ivey draws on Black German women to show how Afrofuturist ideas can inspire action. So in the performance, when she shows the Black German women on the screen, she counts down from 10 to 1, and one by one, we see different Black German women and one little girl with their eyes closed, slowly opening their eyes. Each person stands before a Black backdrop with what looks like stars floating behind them. Thus, rather than locating them in a specific time and place, this backdrop makes their testimony seem eternally relevant, but perhaps even coming from the future. During the moments when they are not speaking, they remain as a kind of audience. But rather than observing Ivey, they appear to be observing the audience. An example of reversing the gaze, which is even more empowering within a space that is normally marked by racial and class privilege like theater. So one of the prompts Ivey poses to the Black German women is, what is the importance of Black activism? Sharon Dodu-Otu is one of the women she has interviewed, and she makes a connection between the current epidemic of police shootings of Black men and the lynch mobs of the post-Reconstruction South. Making this connection could be related to Afrofuturist thought because it contradicts the idea of linear progress. If a narrative of linear progress would suggest that conditions for Black people are supposed to get increasingly better, especially following the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and more recently the first 2 terms of America's first Black president, then a challenge to this progress narrative would suggest that time passing does not indicate improvement. Rather, things can at any moment return to being bad and perhaps get even worse. So another way that Otu's statement resonates with Afrofuturism is she wonders how our ancestors who were faced with the threat of lynch mobs didn't give up hope. So, and the performance ends with Ivey posing with each woman and the little girl making "I have a dream" statements, which are clearly a reference to Martin Luther King Jr. And the little girl describes a fantasy of the future that's very harmonious, in touch with nature, freedom, and space to be creative and play. So now, earlier I mentioned that in addition to Afrofuturism, there's such a thing called African futurism. And sci-fi author Nnedi Okorafor often refers to this term in her social media posts and insists people refer to her as an African futurist. This is how she describes the term, or defines the term, primarily that African futurism decenters the West. It centers on Africa. It is specifically and more directly rooted in African culture, history, mythology, and a point of view as it then branches into the Black diaspora. So that would contrast with the Black German performance I looked at. Since Ivy lives in Germany, she's situated in the West, and a lot of the discussion she's having has to do with the culture there. So to give you an example of what African futurism looks like, I would like to close my talk with a reading short film Poomsie, which is available on YouTube. This also gives me an opportunity to connect research to questions of teaching. One of the questions I was asked to address today was how to connect Afrofuturism to education and science advocacy. One of the biggest questions Afrofuturism asks on the STEM side of things is how to get more young people, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color, interested in STEM. As both an educator and a mother of a young Black son, this is a question I frequently ask myself. My son is 7 and in the 1st grade, so he's only now really being introduced to math and science lessons. I try to support his curiosity in these fields at home, first by buying books that feature Black characters as scientists and mathematicians. And secondly, I try to capitalize on something he already loves, Legos and video games, and find ways to use those for STEM activities, such as building mazes, creating structures to learn cause and effect, and introducing him to coding and video game design. When it comes to my teaching, one of the approaches I have taken is how to better combine STEM with the humanities in order to help students understand that these two fields are not opposed to each other, but rather complement each other very well. Together with 2 other Black female professors in the fields of women and gender studies and environmental studies, I designed a course that could do just that, the course called The Environment, Intersectionality, and Sci-Fi. So the main focus of the course was asking how the genre of sci-fi has been used to address the world's environmental concerns and how these concerns affect characters differently depending on their gender, race, and class. So using this lens, we investigated long-standing global environmental challenges, including water shortages, overpopulation, consumption, and climate change. And here you see a list of the topics we discussed and the films that we used to introduce these topics. So now getting to the film Poomsie. We chose the film Poomsie for the course because not only did it present fantasies of how to deal with environmental problems in the future, but it also featured a Black female heroine, which we felt was important for challenging students' expectations of sci-fi. Poomsie is a Kenyan film directed by Wanuri Kaiu. It was screened at the 2010 Sundance Film Festival as part of its new African Cinemas program. The film is set in the future. We are told 35 years after World War III, or the Water War. The location is the Maitu community in East Africa, surrounded by a desert landscape. We soon learned that in this world, both water and energy are incredibly scarce. So much so that humans are needed to power the grid by laboring on exercise bikes and treadmills, and after such a session, they must wring out the sweat in their clothes and save their urine to be filtered into drinking water. This is a society in which nothing can be taken for granted. We are not told how things have become so dire. As far as we know, nothing exists outside of this African society. The main action in the film revolves around Asha, a Maitu woman who is the curator of the virtual Natural History Museum. One day she receives an anonymous package with a soil sample. She tests the soil and finds no radiation and a high level of moisture, which would indicate that life may have returned outside of the community, something confirmed in a vision she has. But in order to search for the source of the sample, she needs permission from the Maitu Council to leave the community, a request they deny because they doubt her vision. And here we see how, again, Afrofuturism is about trusting the visions, trusting this, non-scientific knowledge that a lot of communities have. So, nevertheless, with the help of a female bathroom attendant, she is able to break out of the compound and go out to plant the tree that she was sent, to which she gives her last bit of water. And in the final shot, we see a tree growing rapidly out of her body, indicating that, trusting in her vision was the right thing to do and that life can return outside of the compound. So as you can see, if one were to compare First Black Women in Space with Poomsie, while Ayibi's performance deals a lot with theoretical issues and issues of representation and activism, Poomsie is about a very concrete environmental problem. What do we do as a society if water becomes too scarce to sustain our communities? One could say that although both texts were created by Black people, Ayibi lives in Western Europe in a wealthy country that has a pretty good track record of addressing issues of sustainability, whereas Caillou, the director of Poomsie, lives in an African country where the possibility of a water shortage might be a much more serious issue due to environmental and economic issues. The difference between these two texts demonstrates in what ways futurism can be useful for Black populations all over the world, even if their approach looks different depending on the context. Thank you. That's all for my presentation. I have these questions that the organizers said I could possibly respond to, but first I'd like to see if there are any questions.
Looks like Heather asked a question in the chat, so I'm just going to read that out loud because I want to make sure to get to audience questions before anything else. She says, your discussion of connecting STEM subjects and courses with socio-historical perspectives on a particular discipline, for example, chemistry, environmental science, etc., really resonated. I wish more courses took this approach. Can you comment more about how these courses were operated, like the readings, the discussions and assignments, and about the reception by the students and your institution/department? And were there any sorts of like resistance? And if there was, how did you overcome that?
Thanks a lot for that question. So this course that I designed, the environment, sci-fi, and intersectionality, it was part of an initiative, a new initiative at UNC called the Triple I Initiative. I'm trying to find so Triple I stands for like inquiry, information, investigation. So these are courses geared towards freshmen. The university saw them as a way to introduce students to our disciplines, to make them familiar with different disciplines. So the response has been mixed. I think the professors who have taught these courses have enjoyed them a lot. I know my co-teachers, we just thought it was so wonderful to be able to see colleagues from across campus, to come in and hear them lecture on their topics of expertise was really great. I think for the professors who are skeptical, they might be resistant to larger courses because this is meant to be kind of a large lecture course. They may also question to what extent this kind of co-teaching would work. From my experience, it worked really well. So the way we divided it up is that the person from environmental science would introduce a topic, so say water pollution, and explain the science behind it to the students. And then we would watch a movie that depicted this problem in the future. And then we would, pick apart the movie and talk about the characters and based on intersectionality. So what kind of characters are there, based on gender, race, how does class affect them? And so each week, we would switch off who was leading the course. as far as reading goes, we normally assign them scientific readings, but scientific readings that were accessible to a general audience. But yeah, I mean, the feedback from the students was great. They really loved it. It ended up being a smaller course. I think we had about 25 students. And they just loved the way all of these disciplines came together, the idea of thinking transdisciplinarily. I think what helped us succeed was that for us, it was about introducing them to our discipline by giving them specific tools. Like, so this is how we take apart a film in film studies, or these are some core questions we ask in gender studies, without thinking, oh, after 15 weeks, they're going to understand the whole discipline. So I think taking that kind of a targeted approach really worked.
I actually kind of want to ask a follow-up on that. Do you see that sort of being kind of like scalable to, like, you mentioned this course was kind of designed for freshmen, so like scalable to like graduate students or even older people, older students in the undergraduate system who maybe like specialize in environmental science, for example, but like would really benefit from kind of like a kind of like concentrated approach to like intersectional thinking? And like, is that something you're interested in doing? Or
I mean, I think it's possible. I haven't taken this approach to graduate teaching yet, but at UNC, we have a pretty strong medical humanities program. And I know that one of the courses they have is geared towards med students. And it's about teaching med students how to like improve their interpersonal communication and their bedside manner through reading literary texts and talking about empathy and things like that. So to me, that's one example of how this can be very useful for postgraduate work. So I think in general, yeah, we need to think about the ways that humanities and STEM can work together. But also, I know one of the questions you had posed was, working with the community. I think also part of it is thinking like, depending on the discipline you're teaching in, what issues is the community facing, and how can we kind of bridge the gap, not just between STEM and humanities, but between the university and the community, to make the knowledge that we are working on at the university accessible for people outside of it.
absolutely. So we are at time, and I know that a lot of the people who attend these webinars are students who need to get back to work. So I want to like kind of like say, if you do need to head back, I understand and you are welcome to do so. Very quickly, I want to just, Priscilla, if you are available to continue answering questions, we can absolutely stay on. But I do really quickly want to plug that Afrofuturism Week will be continuing throughout the rest of this week. We have a movie night tomorrow night, a panel on science policy and education on Wednesday, and a conversation with some speculative fiction authors on Thursday, as well as a discussion of Afrofuturism in comics with the Black Science Coalition Initiative. Or Institute, sorry. So Annabelle just sent the link into the chat. You are welcome to register for any and all of those events. That's my plug. You can also see what else will be happening for the rest of the month. So with that, thank y'all for joining us officially. Keep questions coming if you're interested and you have any. I had another question, honestly, if you have a second. So yeah, you mentioned kind of like,
I have time, yeah.
Okay, great. So you mentioned African futurism as like one example of kind of like a distinction, and you also mentioned, and I, recognize that there were, I remember reading that there are some differences in experience between kind of like an African American or a Black German and then an immigrant to that country who is, Black from maybe perhaps just like directly from Africa. And maybe the depictions in Afrofuturism or like kind of the interventions you might anticipate being needed might be different. Can you speak to like maybe if the themes in like the genre, like in the literature, in the artwork, in the theater are different, or do you think that they're quite unified and kind of like the interventions that an advocate might choose to pursue kind of end up being the same?
I think there are some important differences. So, excuse me. One thing about Afrofuturism written by African American authors, especially the earlier texts that I mentioned, is that there was often this kind of fantasizing about African histories, right? So if you think of Black Panther, this idea of like a hidden civilization that's super advanced and no one knows about. So a lot of times people will say that African American authors tended to write stories like that because for Black Americans, you know, who are the descendants of the enslaved, their ancestors were cut off from their culture, right? So they don't know anything about their ethnicity, their you know, religion, cultures. So a lot of it is about kind of fantasizing. Okay, what could life have been like in Africa? You know, what could our cultural heritage be? And that part of that is also saying that we even have a heritage, right? Because for a long time in the U.S., part of making Black people feel inferior was to say to them, "You don't have a past." You know, like, you know, a lot of white Americans can say, "Oh, well, my family's from Poland or my family's from Ireland." You know, they can pinpoint a certain history, a certain trajectory. For the descendants of slaves, they can't necessarily say, you know, say, okay, my people are from this specific place. So for a lot of Black American authors, it was all about, you know, inventing a past and saying, you know, we have a right to a past. We have contributed to human history. I think when I think of the Black German texts I analyzed, I would say they deal more with colonialism, because these are people who aren't the descendants of slaves, but they're maybe the descendants of people who moved to Europe, you know, in the early 20th century, or even, you know, the late 20th century. A lot of times African students would come to study, you know, in Germany, or manual workers would, you know, went to East Germany to learn a trade. So the trajectory is just very different. And it's more like working through the colonial past, especially since even though Germany had colonies in Africa, it was for a short time, and a lot of people don't know that, and they don't really talk about it that much. So I feel like for Black Germans, it's more about, you know, targeting that, you know, blind spot in their history, as opposed to commenting on transatlantic slavery. So, and yeah, for the African futurists, like one author, a South African author I know, Mohala Nashigo, will say, you know, I don't have to invent a past because I grew up in Africa. You know, like she says, I grew up in South Africa with my relatives, you know, with my culture. I know that what I'm concerned with is, you know, real, like, technological issues, like, you know, how do we have access to clean water? How do we have renewable energy? So I think, yeah, there you will also see big differences with African futurists really focusing on some concrete questions that we face, you know, in the near future, as opposed to the more like theoretical, you know, discussions that people in the rest of the diaspora are thinking about.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I am particularly drawn to kind of, I think like I'm someone who's very interested in environmental justice and climate activism. So I think like that last sort of statement, the last sort of statements you made, like very much drew me in, and I was like, oh, I should like look into this a lot more. I think this will be very interesting. I would like to poke our audience who is still hanging out. If you have any questions, I absolutely think you should ask them right now.
Actually, while I'm here singing, I can post a link to the short film I mentioned, Poomsie, because you can watch the whole thing on YouTube. It's 20 minutes long, so if anybody is curious to watch it, that's where you'll find it.
Ooh, thank you. I'll at least make sure to blast it out to all the registrants so they can check it out in their free time. Mm-hmm. I'll give you guys another minute, but if y'all don't have any questions right now, I highly encourage you to continue to engage with our Black History Month celebration. I want to thank Dr. Layne so much for joining us today and sharing her insight and giving us a really wonderful kickoff kind of introductory talk to this week. So yeah, thank you, Dr. Layne. Thank you all for showing up, and look forward to seeing you throughout the rest of the week.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. Bye.